I'm thrilled to be here with Bruno del Alma. I'm Aaron Turner from One Thought. And each in our own way, we're bringing a completely different perspective to what drives the potential for change. I think all of us in our own lives and in our own organizations and work, we're trying to get things done. Maybe we're trying to make a difference. And it's very accepted that you guys and work hard. But in our conversations preparing for this session, Bruno and I have really highlighted on a huge driver of the potential for change and impact. And that's rarely explored in a systematic way. And we wanted to share our conversation about that. And we'd love to hear from you. So we know that you all have had experiences that chime with what we're talking about. We'd love to hear it. We'd love your questions. We'd love your input. So we'll do our best to keep an eye on the chat to get you involved. So I wanted to give a brief introduction to Bruno del Alma. Probably you know him already. And I'll tell you, it's not to big him up in any way, but given the conversation that we're going to have, I think it's quite important that you know he's no slouch. Whereas me, maybe, perhaps, but Bruno, no slouch. So as you may or may not know, Bruno is the executive chairman of ARBA, a European fintech focused on financial wellness, and was the co-founder of Global X, which recognized as one of the most innovative and fastest growing firms in the ETF sector, which I'm sure you guys know about. And the reason I say that is because you can see he's obviously a driven, capable professional who's really achieved a lot in his field. In preparation to talk about change, radical change, it's easier than you think if you know where it comes from or what allows it or what drives it. We got to a really interesting point in our conversation, and Bruno, I thought it would be nice to start there. If you wanted to say a few words, it sounded like, you know, you talked when we spoke last week that there was a moment where you had a real shift in orientation. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about Bruno Mark 1 and Bruno Mark 2, what that shift was about and what came out of it.
Yeah, and I think that our audience, our guests, got a glimpse of that on the 5-minute video. Maybe the fact that there's been a radical change. You know, the radical change seems radical when you look at it, you know, and you go back a few years, but it's very progressive actually. Every little change, it's sort of small, you know, but when you have a lot of very small changes, you end up looking, you know, very different yourself, myself. I think maybe what actually really accelerated my change to maybe start there, which may not quite be your question, Aaron, but I'll do that anyway, and you'll correct me and redirect me. But what I think really accelerated my changes was you know, managing people, and you know, my you know, Bruno 1.0 management style was one of you know, this is I was always considered a good manager. You know, this is how I like to manage people. This is how I like to be managed, and I sort of put all of my best ideas together, and this is sort of how I manage my team. And so the consequence of that is that I was managing everybody the same way. And of course, that worked very well for some people, didn't work well for other people. And so, you know, my initial reaction was, well, that's not my problem, that's your problem. But for sure, obviously, that was my problem. And so I had to adjust. I had to adjust to different people, sort of perceptions and priorities and individual preferences. But what a pain in the ass, right? Because managing everybody the same way is very easy. You know, adjusting to individuals takes work and effort and commitment. And so my big change really started when you know, in some ways I was self-defining my job. You know, when you're a senior person in an organization, the biggest part of your job is people and managing people. And so if I was defining that piece of my job to be a pain in the ass, my job was a pain in the ass.
Yeah.
And so I kind of almost really for, my self-happiness, I had to say, hey, this is really not a pain. This is actually a challenge, and it's an opportunity to grow, and it's an opportunity to develop. And, there's only so much you can learn about, and there's decreasing economies of scale to learn about sales and marketing and finance, etc.
Yes.
But I felt like, managing people was ultimately about humanity. And I felt like that was an unlimited sort of field. And so that's what kind of started to open me up or accelerate maybe what the direction that I had, which was really to start focusing on understanding people. And, I was always empathetic. I always liked people. I always cared about people. But I cared a lot about me, and I cared a lot about my personal success. And it just started to change my perception a little bit. And over time, as I said, it sort of accelerated.
Yeah. The first thing I wanted to pick up that I think is really important is there's a definite pattern in what you're saying. The two really key points in what you're saying. The first part is anything that happens, you can see the role of where you're at in it, or you can see the role of where other people are at in it. Now, there's no doubt that in any situation, everybody involved plays a role. But if you attribute everything outside of yourself, you cannot change. You cannot change, and you cannot have change, because you're basically saying that it's being determined by other people, which is what you said. It's like, well, God, something wrong with them. They don't like my management style, which is really cute. And you're absolutely right. As soon as you start to see, well, what is happening in me that's part of this dynamic, and what we started to talk about in the introductory session is particularly in terms of your clarity of mind, which is what you said is like in technical issues, there's a limited scope. Like there's limited scope to different technical issues, like you said, marketing and all those. But when you look at human beings, because there's an unlimited potential of mind, there is an infinite depth. And what I loved about what you said is when you started looking towards humanity, you saw a depth. And when you saw a depth, you discovered something about what you were capable of and started going about things differently.
Yeah, and it wasn't that fast. Unfortunately, it took me a lot longer.
I was compressing it like a stop frame.
But I'll use that as an opportunity, and I think I'm maybe more fully answering really what your first question was, which was sort of the nature of that change. But staying for a minute on the trigger of that change, I saw that on this group of people. Kyle Chudom is one of the attendees, so I'll give him a shout out because he was a huge part of what I now describe. I have terms that I've picked up from reading books that help me explain some of the things that I experienced after the fact. But importantly for me, this sort of change in mindset is experiential, right? I believe it because I'm seeing things that are happening to me that just sort of, start to opening things that sort of, begin to illustrate that maybe the world functions in a way that's a little bit more, a lot deeper, frankly, and very different than maybe the linear, simplistic way in which I thought it worked. And so shout out for Kyle, because Kyle read this book called Conscious Capitalism. Conscious Capitalism was about, managing businesses in a more holistic way. So, it's not just about shareholder returns, but in fact, you can generate more shareholder returns if you care about your team, the employees, you care about suppliers, you care about the environment where you operate and the society where you operate. And so if you do that, you'll do better for yourself and of course for the entire ecosystem. And he's the one that kind of bought that book. He said, this is how I manage he's a very successful financial advisor, manages a very large business, and works with many families. And not only this is how I sort of manage my practice, I want to do it now that I have sort of a framework more fully, but I also want to start investing my clients' capital this way. And oh, by the way, Bruno, you have an asset management firm. Why don't you bring a fund that sort of does that? And he was very insistent. He bought all the books. He did a lot of the homework for us, And I loved it. I loved the concept. It really resonated with me, but I wasn't sure if it was going to be a commercial success. Anyway, in his insistence, the product came to market. In his insistence, I went to the annual conference of conscious capitalism, and I discovered sort of a world of kind of a Woodstock of capitalism. You know, capitalists that cared about building, were very successful business people, build incredible businesses. One of the founders is the founder of Whole Foods, and it just gave me a kind of a different perspective. But I bring that up as that was part of my journey, and it was, if you start looking at the signs of, you know, what Kyle did and the kinds of things that it opened up. And I think, to your point, you start sort of, once you start realizing these things, you start paying more attention to these things and you start following that. And so that was part of the process. I operated differently. The difference in operating, to your question, is that before it was, you know, this is my objective, this is the steps to get to there, and it was very analytical. Now it's more trusting that there's a path for me, pay attention to it, be open to it. And when the opportunity is there, it's not a totally passive thing, but it is a little more passive, but it's active in that you have to understand your environment very well. And you have to pay attention to opportunities. And when the opportunities show up, like Kyle in my life, you have to act in an instant. And you have to be very sensitive to those opportunities. And you have to be sensitive to other parts of your operation, which is not just your brain. Your brain is an incredible tool. You got to use it. But also be sensitive to your heart and your body and your, you know, the term gut feel. It's a term for a reason. Information comes to us through the gut, and we can get information in other ways. And so be mindful and pay attention to those signs in your body as things come to you, and what that may mean. And if your heart is pumping about something, it's probably important.
I love hearing you talk about this, Bruno, and the reason I think this is such a great session is because so most of what I do day to day is pointing to the system behind what you're talking about. And what I really like about what you're saying is that you looked in the direction of what I would call a deeper clarity of mind, and you discovered that there was a different way of operating. In a way, you could call it surfing the bigger potential of the mind, as opposed to swimming with the intellect. And if you think about the ocean as an analogy, waves are much more powerful than your arms. And
right now,
and what's really interesting when I work with people in any field is that they've, and whether it's in the military or sports or business, they've always had experience when they were in the flow of a more powerful state of mind, driven by a more comprehensive system, intelligence, processing that they're not doing, but they are getting the benefits of. But it's rare that people see, oh, this isn't weird. This isn't a philosophy. This is a system. I've stumbled on a more fundamental mental system. So instead of just tinkering, like the way my mum uses a smartphone, it might as well be a regular phone. And that's the way we use the mind. We use the mind like a pedestrian processor, but there are depths to the power of it. And when you stumble on a freer, clearer mind, not only do you get a richer feeling, and you realize, oh, there are breadcrumbs of the mind that you can follow, right? There's something to surf here. But also, your feeling of effort goes down, but your impact goes up, you know, and that's true for athletes, and it's true in the financial services. And if you step back, it's an undeniable system, but it's hard to talk about because it's not on people's dashboards. So when people say things like you're saying, a lot of times they'll say, oh, well, Bruno has a new philosophy. I'm so happy for him. I got to get to work. But I really like the idea that we can step back and ask people to take a look. Does this square with your experience? There's a system at play here. There are levels of mental clarity at which you gain more and more leverage, more and more richness of feeling, and you put in less and less effort because there's a more comprehensive intelligence at play.
Yeah. And I think, you know, reality is what it is. It works, things work. how they work, and then we have our interpretation of that. But the reality is whatever the reality is.
Yes.
And I think the iPhone analogy and how you use that and how maybe you use it and your mom uses it is it's sort of a great analogy in that, the phone is what it is, and you
Yes.
use it however you want to use it. And of
Yes.
course, your understanding of the iPhone and the capabilities, or whatever smartphone, allows you to use it more fully or not. And of course, it's very intuitive and it's very easy. I think our life is not intuitive, and certainly the way we're educated and the way we're brought up and the way we experience life, to me anyway, a lot of these things were non-intuitive, and in fact,
Yes.
the opposite. I think they're very counterintuitive. And so, I think it's difficult to have a conversation like this to begin with, because I
Yeah.
think the peers certainly in my finance industry, which is very left brain and very analytical, and I'm very analytical, they will probably think that, I think a big percentage of my industry would think that I'm insane. Me 5 years ago would think that I'm insane.
Yes.
And I don't really actually understand kind of the reality, kind of the iPhone that we're operating. I don't have a sense. I don't have a good
Yes.
sense of how it works.
Yes.
But I do have an experiential sense that I do think I've been using it like your mom uses the smartphone. I think I've been underusing it. And experientially, I have experienced what you've been talking about, which is that I can do a lot more in my life, actually being a lot less active. And I did, and I encourage people, by the way, I was very apprehensive about working with a coach to help with these kinds of things, because to me, I was educated with a family that was very traditional, that it's almost like a psychologist or a psychiatrist. If you hire somebody, it's because you have a problem, and it's sort of a sign of weakness. And so a coach to me, was the same kind of taste, right? The same smell of like, I don't have any problems, I can fend for myself. I don't need a coach. And somebody brought this great analogy to me when I was thinking about these things, and I was like, well, maybe I need a coach. And I was asking people, and I asked a friend of mine that I knew was sort of, generally supportive of using a coach to help, with your life, your business. He knew I was from Spain, and he used this great analogy that totally worked, which is, what do you think of Rafa Nadal, the tennis player? Is he, how good is he in the world? Well, he's one of the best in the world. And do you think he's one of the people that maybe the top 20 people in the world that knows the most about tennis? And it's like, well, it's possible for sure. And what would you think if Rafa Nadal did not use a coach? And I thought, well, that would be a mistake. And so he said, what makes you so special? And we're operating in fields that are difficult and challenging. And I certainly wasn't, a top 20 in the world in what I was doing. And a coach was very helpful. Anyway, this coach was working with me and was telling me exactly what you were saying. Bruno, you got to slow down. And to me, that sounded all great. And, but the reality was, once the session over, I got to run a business and do a million things. And slowly I started doing it. I started slowing down. I started meditating. I started taking more time for myself, spending time in nature, and doing a whole bunch of things that, some of which I was already doing, which is much more accepted in our society. It's very accepted to take care of your body, very accepted to take care of your mind, less accepted maybe to take care of your soul. And so things like, your body, sleep, sleep well and enough hours, have a healthy diet, exercise, daily if you can. So all of those things are very accepted. I was doing some of those things, but the things that maybe were less accepted and are becoming increasingly accepted, like, for example, meditating, those types of tools that I now believe are very, very helpful for everybody to essentially increase their operating system and have a better working kind of smartphone, to your analogy.
The thing I wanted to add to what you're saying, Bruno, because I think it would be interesting to people. I founded One Thought because I started to understand levels of clarity, which is what you're talking. You went from a very analytic. People's minds get bottlenecked when they're analyzing. It shuts down the efficiency of a deeper clarity of mind. And we live in a world in which that's seen as high functioning. And all of the problems that are associated with high level analyzing, intense analyzing, like stress, like overwhelm, like the inability to sleep very well, are just seen as, aren't seen as related to that mental mode. And so when I saw that one of the problems a lot of people had is they were trying to live and work in an unclear state of mind, and they could be in a clear state of mind, which was essentially more natural, I deliberately decided this needs to be in the mainstream, because in the mainstream, our model of a normal mind is not a clear, deeper mind. So our model of normal does not include the potential of a clearer, freer, deeper mind. And that's kind of what you illustrated. So I think it's really useful to say, hey, yeah, you don't, the normal state of mind is not clinically dysfunctional, but it's by no means a clear mind, and it's by no means what's possible, and it has problems associated with it, with relationships, with leadership, with stress, with sleeping. And if you look at all the things that you mentioned, Bruno, people sleep better when their mind's free. People eat better when their mind's free. People exercise easier when their mind's free. So one of the very first clients I had when I was an intern about 20 years ago was a young woman who had gotten into mental health problems and had been asked to take medication, and then her weight ballooned, and so she was really unhappy, and she ate really badly, and she didn't exercise. She wanted to talk about eating healthy, losing weight, and exercising. I wanted to talk about the fact that she didn't feel good, because that meant she wasn't in a clearer mind. Now, when she was in a clearer mind, all of a sudden, without even trying, she was eating better and exercising, and she got a boyfriend and a job. And then as soon as her state of mind would deteriorate, she'd lose her boyfriend and a job, and she stopped eating good. So we're starting to see, well, what's the horse and what's the cart? And in order to do that, you kind of have to question that the normal state of mind is the state of mind you're looking at. And I think you really clearly illustrated that.
Yeah, and I think it'll be great. Maybe Aaron, we have amazing people with us. I don't know if there's a way to have them maybe share some of their experiences operating.
I would love that. I don't know if there's a way for people to put their hand up or to
or just maybe write on on the text if they have a question or they want to join.
Oh, fantastic. If you're a foodie or wino, hop into Thrill. I'm going to advertise other sessions here. No,
I think as we wait for maybe questions or thoughts, I think it's also important to note that it's just the stereotypes that I did business in my undergrad. I did business in my MBA. I had a leadership class in every one of them, a decade apart or what have you. And it was terrible. I mean, it was what we were taught was leadership. What I was taught was leadership, I believe is fundamentally wrong. Yeah. And I'm happy to see that universities are doing a much, much better job now at talking about leadership and bringing in some of these concepts that we're talking about. But, the old leadership style that I was taught, which kind of, I think, perpetuated these paradigms that are wrong about how you're supposed to operate, was very much about these, A-type, real-driven, kind of hard-nosed, know-it-all type of person. And increasingly a lot of academics have started producing a lot of research that show that that kind of the leader that brings the team together and it's collaborative and can, instead of creating a situation of fear, creates a situation of kind of trust and comfort, and you can take risk and you can bring your opinions, and everybody's sort of invited to contribute. And of course, having diversity in teams. And so, it is sort of not surprising, I think, particularly in the business world, that it's hard to bring these things to bearing. But at the same time, you're also seeing, for example, the largest hedge fund in the world, they have rooms for everybody to meditate, and the founder is a lifelong meditator. And so you're seeing more and more some of these things sort of starting to emerge, and it just makes sense because it's, to your point, it's how it works. People operate a bit better, the businesses do better, you do better in your personal life. I think another point
Oh,
that is
hey,
very hard. Go
I
ahead.
have a question here, Bruno. So I'm going to take advantage of it because I think we're running out of time. So what the question is, it's a brilliant question. So what sources of information do you let in versus shut out to keep your mind clear, i.e. media, research? So I'll let us both answer briefly. So the current model of clarity of mind is that the world and things in the world are disturbing your clarity of mind. So your phone, do an electronic detox, media, taking less information. From my experience, all you need to do is understand how the mind works, and it won't matter what information you take in. So it's the way we relate to our thinking about the information. So for every piece of information, you could have a reactive thought. If you don't follow that reactive thought, there's nothing to make you reactive. So it's getting a feel for not reacting to your own internal tripwires. And you don't need to meditate to do that. It could be helpful. I don't. But it's just getting an understanding of what's stimulating you and what's a useful thought and what's not. And you can learn to navigate that just through understanding. Bruno, I don't know if you had anything to say about that.
Yeah, I have a slightly nuanced, slightly different version of that. I do think the most damaging sources for the US population as a whole, really the world population as a whole, the most damaging are TV and social media. You can gain a tremendous amount of time and mental clarity if you want shutting them down entirely, which is difficult to do, but if you can do it, that's great, and do as little as that as possible. I actually think as it relates to the things that you're involved with, I think you have to be very informed. And by that, I don't mean, if you're in finance, have CNBC sort of blasting in the office. I think that's very damaging. But do read about the industry and do, research and news and be on top of and really have an understanding of the system and the world that you're operating in. And I think that information is very helpful, but be very selective, find good sources. And so I kind of have these kind of slightly
different. No, it makes sense. And just to play devil's advocate for people, one of the things that I've noticed is there's a link between how speeded up someone's mind is and how compelled they are to look at social media. So in the world, social media gets the blame, but actually you can see that our susceptibility to having an unhealthy relationship with inputs goes with how unclear and speeded up our mind is. As we get, it looks to me like as we get more speeded up, we get more susceptible to an unhealthy relationship to stimulus. So if you start with your clarity of mind, that looks to me a more leveraged way to go.
The other thing I would say is books. So find books that speak to you. I think everybody's path is different, so find what speaks to you. And if you're religious or spiritual, I find spiritual master books to be super helpful.
You got a big echo there from Lisa. Books. Okay, so I think we're at time. I'm obsessed with punctuality. So lunch break coming up. All right.
Fantastic.
Tea time for
Thank
me.
you, everybody.
Tea time for me. Bruno, it's been an absolute pleasure meeting you, and really nice to talk to you about this today. I think hopefully it's helpful to people to come at this issue, which is a really powerful issue in terms of well-being and work. So then people can go to networking now, and then in half an hour back to the main stage. Bruno, thank you so much. I hope we talk again soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for coming, everybody.